A single moment, a dropped wallet, a discovery that would detonate the quiet, fragile world of a young woman. For 23-year-old Clara Maeve, life was a relentless treadmill of exhaustion and worry, a reality haunted by the ghost of a mother she lost too soon. But on a rain-slick Thursday night, when New York's most reclusive billionaire, Julian Croft, leaves his wallet on the counter of a timeless diner, Clara uncovers something impossible inside, a faded photograph of her own long-dead mother. Why is the one woman whose memory she cherishes tucked away in the wallet of a man who lost his own family and has everything else? The answer is a dark, meticulously buried secret, a truth far more dangerous and heartbreaking than she could ever comprehend. The Starlight Diner wasn't a place you found by accident. It was a relic, a pocket of old New York nestled on a quiet street in Greenwich Village, stubbornly refusing to yield to the glass and steel towers that clawed at the sky around it. With its worn checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and the low hum of a classic jukebox, it was a sanctuary of comforting simplicity. For Clara, it was the battlefield where she fought for her life. It was the place she traded a practiced, patient smile and aching feet for the rent on her cramped two-bedroom apartment and the mountain of medical bills for her younger brother, Leo. Every day was a parade of faces, a stream of stories she half heard, but some faces etched themselves into the landscape of her routine. Mr. Croft was one of them. Julian Croft was a permanent fixture at the far end of the counter, the seat by the window that looked out onto the wet, reflective street. He came in every morning for black coffee and toast, and every evening for a bowl of soup, always alone. He was a man who seemed carved from grief and steel, with deep-set gray eyes that held the permanent shadow of a forgotten storm. The financial papers called him a phantom, a ruthless visionary who had conquered the city's skyline, building a real estate empire from the ground up. To the staff at the Starlight, he was just the quiet man. He never made small talk, never complained when the coffee was bitter, and always left a crisp $100 bill under his saucer, whether he stayed for 5 minutes or 50. Clara was his usual waitress. It wasn't spoken, just an accepted rhythm. Her boss, a kindly balding man named Sal, said she had a calming presence, that she knew not to pry. She was grateful for the silence, for the unspoken boundary between them, and she was deeply, desperately grateful for that $100 tip, a small fortune that meant she could afford the good bread for Leo's toast or a new book to read to him at night. She'd pour his coffee, set down his soup, and move away, all within the bubble of their shared quiet. She often wondered about him. What did a man with so much money, a man who had famously lost his wife and daughter in a tragic accident years ago, think about as he stared into a bowl of chicken noodle soup? Was his life as empty as the seat beside him? Tonight was different. A cold October storm had descended on the city, its icy rain drumming against the diner's large windows. The usual evening crowd was thin, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and brewing coffee. Mr. Croft seemed more distant than usual, his gaze lost in the rivulets of water tracing paths down the glass. His tailored suit, worth more than Clara made in 6 months, looked less like a symbol of power and more like a heavy suit of armor. He finished his soup in his customary silence, paid with a card as black and featureless as his mood, and slid off the stool. He paused at the door, pulling on a dark overcoat, his shoulders set against the wind. As he did, something slipped from his inner pocket, falling to the worn linoleum with a soft, muffled sound, completely unnoticed as he vanished into the stormy night. Clara saw it. She was wiping down the counter, her eyes, trained to spot a salt shaker out of place or a glass nearly empty, caught the movement. It was a wallet, a simple, elegant black leather wallet, clearly expensive but softened by years of use. Her professional duty was clear. Call out to him. But the street was already empty, the rear lights of his chauffeured sedan already bleeding into the red of a traffic light down the block. Sal would tell her to put it in the lost and found box. That was the rule. Clara bent down and picked it up. It felt warm in her hand, a deeply personal object. Her thumb brushed against the supple leather. Curiosity, a luxury she rarely had the time or energy for, pricked at her. It was a reckless impulse, a complete breach of diner etiquette. But she couldn't fight it. Her hands, usually so steady when balancing a tray of hot plates, trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was what she expected: a row of exclusive credit cards, a driver's license with a face that was severe and unsmiling, and a thick wedge of cash. But tucked behind a transparent sleeve, in a place of honor, was something that didn't belong. It wasn't a picture of his late wife, the beautiful socialite whose face was still splashed across tribute pages of society magazines. It was a small, square photograph, its corners softened with age. It showed a young woman with a wild mane of honey blonde hair, her head thrown back in a laugh. She was in a lab, a white coat hanging loosely off her shoulders, a pair of safety goggles pushed up on her forehead. Her smile was brilliant, a flash of pure, uninhibited joy. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue-green, crinkled at the corners with a warmth that felt achingly familiar. Clara's breath caught in her chest, a painful, sharp gasp. The world around her, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the soft crooning of the jukebox, the steady drumming of the rain, receded into a muted roar. She knew that smile. She knew those eyes. She had spent 1,000 nights staring at the only other copy of that photograph, the one that sat in a simple silver frame on her nightstand. It was her mother, Isabel Maeve, the woman who had been stolen from her life 15 years ago in a brutal hit and run, leaving behind nothing but a handful of photos, a mountain of unanswered questions, and a daughter with a permanently fractured heart. Clara's knees felt weak. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. Why? How could this be? What was a picture of her mother, a brilliant but penniless research scientist, doing in the wallet of Julian Croft, a man whose grief was as famous as his fortune? The question slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. The simple, grueling reality of her life, work, Leo, worry, repeat, suddenly felt like a fragile dam, and it was breaking. In her hand, she held the proof. Proof of a connection that was both impossible and undeniable. And with that proof came a terrifying, gut-wrenching realization. The story she had been told about her mother's death, the random, tragic story she had built her life upon, was a lie. The next 24 hours were a blur of muted horror. Clara moved through the rest of her shift like an automaton, her mind a raging sea of shock and disbelief. She placed the wallet in the diner's safe, as Sal instructed, but the image of that photograph was seared onto the back of her eyelids. Sleep was a torment, her dreams a chaotic slideshow of her mother's laughing face dissolving into the cold, stone-like grief of Julian Croft. Who was he to her? A secret benefactor? A former colleague? A hidden lover? Each possibility felt more outlandish, more impossible than the last. The mother Clara remembered, through the hazy lens of an 8-year-old's memory, was a force of nature. Isabel Maeve was a whirlwind of brilliance and warmth, a woman who smelled of coffee and chemicals, who could explain photosynthesis with marshmallows and diagram a cell on a napkin. She had been a junior researcher at Vance Pharmaceuticals, a rising star, they said. They were poor, living in a tiny apartment in Queens, but their life had been rich with love and laughter. Then one rainy night, she was gone. A car had jumped the curb as she was walking home from the bus stop. The driver was never found. It was a tragedy, a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, the police had said. Clara and 4-year-old Leo were sent to live with a series of indifferent foster families until Clara turned 18 and could finally claim guardianship of her brother herself. How could that woman, the woman from her fragmented memories, be connected to a man who lived in a penthouse that overlooked the entire city? By morning, a cold, hard resolve had formed in Clara's core. She couldn't unsee the photo. She couldn't unknow this impossible connection. The fear of what she might uncover was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was nothing compared to the agony of the mystery. She had to ask him. She had to stand before him and demand to know the truth. She knew his schedule. He would be at his headquarters, Croft Tower, a sleek, imposing monolith of black glass that seemed to challenge the very sky. It was a fortress, utterly inaccessible to a girl like her. But she had the key. She had his wallet. Dressed in her best clothes, dark slacks and a simple navy blue blouse, Clara clutched the wallet in her damp hands and took the subway into the heart of Manhattan. Standing before the towering building, she felt a tremor of fear. Men and women in impeccably tailored suits swept past her, their faces masks of ambition. She was a ghost here, a creature from a different world. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she pushed through the revolving doors and approached the massive, intimidating marble reception desk. "I need to see Mr. Julian Croft," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. The receptionist, a woman with a severe haircut and an even more severe smile, eyed her with unconcealed disdain. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's a personal matter. I have something that belongs to him." Clara held up the wallet. The receptionist's expression remained frozen. "You can leave that with me. I will ensure it reaches Mr. Croft's executive assistant." "No," Clara insisted, her grip tightening on the worn leather. "I have to give it to him myself. It's important." It was a stalemate. The receptionist was reaching for a button under her desk, presumably to call security, when a sharp, authoritative female voice sliced through the tension of the lobby. "Is there a problem here?" Clara turned to see a woman in her late 40s, gliding towards them. She was the epitome of corporate power, dressed in a steel gray dress that was both elegant and severe. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a flawless chignon, and her blue eyes were as cold and sharp as shards of ice. Clara recognized her instantly from newspaper clippings and business journals. It was Eleanor Vance, CEO of Vance Pharmaceuticals, and Julian Croft's sister-in-law. "This young woman was insisting on seeing Mr. Croft personally," the receptionist explained, her tone fawning. Eleanor Vance's icy gaze fell upon Clara, sweeping over her from head to toe, a silent, brutal calculation. Her eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on the wallet in Clara's hand. A flicker of something, was it recognition, annoyance, crossed her features before being instantly suppressed. "Mr. Croft is in a very important meeting," Eleanor said, her voice smooth as silk but with an undercurrent of steel. "I'm his sister-in-law. You can entrust his property to me." "I'd rather wait," Clara said, standing her ground. Eleanor's perfectly sculpted lips tightened into a thin line. She seemed about to dismiss Clara with a flick of her wrist when the private elevator doors behind the reception desk swished open. Julian Croft stood there, his face a mask of grim impatience. He was talking on his phone, but he stopped mid-sentence when he saw the scene at the desk. His eyes met Clara's, and a flicker of recognition, then confusion, crossed his face. "What is this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that cut through the lobby's hushed atmosphere. "Julian," Eleanor said, her voice instantly softening into a tone of gentle concern. "This girl found your wallet. I was just telling her you were busy and that I would take it for her." Julian's gaze shifted from Eleanor to Clara, then to the wallet in her hand. He ended his call. "Come up," he said to Clara, his tone flat and unreadable. He turned and stepped back into the elevator without a second glance. The elevator ride to the penthouse was a silent, suffocating ascent. The doors opened into an office that felt more like a modern art gallery, vast, minimalist, and cold. A single, enormous window offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the city below. Julian Croft walked to the window, his back to her. "I appreciate you returning my wallet," he said, his voice distant. "Honesty is a rare commodity. Leave it on the desk. Tell my assistant your name. I'll have a substantial reward sent to you." His dismissal was so total, so utterly indifferent, it lit a fire under Clara's fear. She was not a problem to be solved with money. "I don't want a reward, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice trembling but clear. He finally turned, and the full force of his stormy gray eyes hit her. It felt like being écrasé, as if he could see every fear, every insecurity, every ounce of grief she carried. "Then what do you want?" he asked, a hint of impatience in his tone. This was it. Her heart hammered against her ribs as if trying to escape. She walked forward and placed the wallet on the immense glass desk that stood between them like a barrier. With fumbling fingers, she opened it, pulled out the faded photograph, and held it up. The image of her mother's joyful face seemed to glow in the sterile gray light of the office. "I want to know," she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain, "why you have a picture of my mother in your wallet." The change in him was terrifying. The air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. The practiced, weary indifference on his face shattered, replaced by a mask of pure, glacial fury. A muscle jumped in his clenched jaw. "Where did you get that?" he hissed, his voice dangerously low. "It was in here," Clara stammered, pointing at the wallet. "Her name was Isabel Maeve. She was my mother. She died 15 years ago. So I'm asking you again, why do you have her picture?" Julian Croft moved from behind the desk in 2 long strides. His presence so overwhelming, the vast office suddenly felt like a closet. He snatched the photo from her hand, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "You have no idea what you're meddling in," he said, his voice a venomous whisper that was more frightening than any shout. "You think you've uncovered some sentimental secret, some forgotten affair." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh, devoid of any humor. "You know nothing. Your mother, she was not who you think she was. Now take the wallet, leave this office, and forget you ever saw this. Forget you ever met me. It is for your own good." He was trying to frighten her away. He was succeeding, but the image of her mother's smile, so full of life, gave Clara a strength she didn't know she had. "No," she said, her chin lifting. "My entire life has been a question I couldn't answer. I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth." He stared down at her, his eyes searching her face. For a fleeting second, a different emotion broke through the fury, something ancient and unreadable. Was it pain? Regret? In that moment, she didn't see a ruthless billionaire. She saw a man haunted by a ghost. "The truth?" Julian Croft said, his voice softening to a near whisper, yet carrying a weight that chilled her to the bone. "The truth would destroy you." Clara held his gaze, refusing to buckle under the weight of his threat. Her whole life had been shaped by a void, an emptiness where her mother should have been. What could be more destructive than the life she was already living? "Try me," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Whatever it is, it can't be worse than not knowing." Julian watched her, a long, silent appraisal. The rage in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by a deep, weary resignation, as if he were surrendering to an outcome he had spent years trying to prevent. He ran a hand through his dark, graying hair, a gesture so shockingly human it startled her. For the first time, he just looked tired. He turned from her and walked back to the window, staring down at the city sprawled below like a map of his own life. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken history. "Vance Pharmaceuticals," he began, his voice distant. "Your mother was a researcher there, wasn't she? In their primary drug development division?" Clara flinched. "Yes. How did you know that?" "I know a great many things, Miss Maeve," he said, not turning. "You believe your mother died in a hit and run, a tragic, random accident." "That's what the police told me." "The police," he said, the words dripping with scorn. "The police tell the stories they are paid to tell." He finally faced her, his expression grim. "Your mother's death was no accident. She was murdered." The word hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Murdered. The ugly, violent word didn't fit with the warm, laughing memories she clung to. "Who? Why?" she whispered, her throat tight. He gestured to one of the severe leather chairs opposite his desk. "Sit down. If you insist on hearing this, you should be sitting." Clara sank into the chair, her legs no longer able to support her. Julian remained standing, a sentinel guarding a terrible secret. "Your mother was more than just a researcher," he said. "She was a genius. She had an integrity that was rare. She was working on Vance's most profitable product, Vancesha, a revolutionary drug for autoimmune disorders. It was their golden goose, earning billions of dollars a year." The name was horribly familiar. It was the drug her brother Leo took every single day. The expensive, life-sustaining medication she worked herself to the bone to afford. "Your mother discovered something," Julian continued, his voice low and intense. "Something she wasn't supposed to find. She found that long-term use of Vancesha caused a slow, progressive, and irreversible form of neurological decay. It was a time bomb hidden in the drug's molecular structure. It would take years, even decades, to manifest, making it nearly impossible to trace back to the source. By the time the symptoms appeared, the patient would be diagnosed with something else entirely." Clara felt a wave of nausea. Leo, her sweet, frail Leo, who had been on Van Siecha for years. She compiled her research, a mountain of irrefutable data, and she took it to the board. She took it to the CEO. He paused, his jaw tightening. She took it to Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, the cold, polished woman from the lobby. Eleanor buried it, Julian said, his voice flat and hard. She told your mother she was mistaken, that her data was flawed. She offered her a promotion, a raise, a corner lab, anything to buy her silence. But Isabel was not for sale. She told Eleanor that if the company wouldn't issue a recall, she would go to the press. She would go to the FDA. She gave them an ultimatum. He looked directly at Clara, his eyes filled with a profound shared grief. A week later, she was dead. Her data, her computer, every trace of her research, vanished. The official story became a tragic accident. Case closed. The story was monstrous, unthinkable. Yet it clicked into place with a terrifying logic, explaining the impossible photo in his wallet. How do you know all this? Clara asked, her voice a raw whisper. Who were you to her? Julian's expression hardened, the look of old pain returning, sharper and more defined this time. I was her sponsor, he said, a silent one. I had invested in a small biotech startup years ago. Isabel was their most promising mind. When Vance Pharmaceuticals bought the company out, they acquired her along with it. I kept track of her. I saw her brilliance, her passion. I started a private research fund, anonymously, to support her side projects. She thought the money was coming from a university grant. We corresponded through letters, through a secure email address. We spoke of science, of ethics, of a better way to do things. I admired her more than anyone I had ever known. He picked up the photograph from his desk, his thumb stroking the worn edge. This was the picture she sent with her last letter. She was on the verge of her breakthrough. She was so full of hope. She was going to change the world. The confession hung between them. He hadn't been her lover. He had been her secret champion, a kindred spirit who had loved her from a distance, a love built on intellect and integrity. After she died, Clara choked out, tears finally streaming down her face. Why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you go to the police with this? Julian let out a bitter, hollow laugh. Go to the police? With what? A theory? An anonymous correspondence? Eleanor Vance is not just a CEO. She is the public face of a beloved company that saves lives. She's a philanthropist, a patron of the arts. Her family has deep ties to politics, to law enforcement. Accusing her of murder with no proof would have been professional suicide, but it was more than that. His stormy eyes met hers, and for the first time, she understood the deep, guarded vigilance she saw in him at the diner. It wasn't indifference, it was protection. Isabel mentioned her children in her letters, he said softly. A daughter named Clara and a young son, Leo. She wrote about you all the time. After she was killed, I hired a private investigator to find you, to make sure you were safe. When I learned you had been lost in the foster system, I was frantic. It took years to locate you. By the time I did, you were 18, fighting for custody of your brother. I wanted to approach you, to tell you everything, but what would that have accomplished? It would have brought you nothing but pain and put you directly in Eleanor's line of sight. If she learned that Isabel's daughter was alive and asking questions, she would see you as a loose end, a threat to be eliminated. The revelation was a physical blow. He hadn't been ignoring her. He had been watching over her. The $100 tips weren't charity. They were a lifeline. The Starlight Diner, a place she'd found through a lucky job listing. Had it been luck at all? He had been her silent, unseen guardian, a phantom angel ensuring she and Leo stayed afloat, hidden from the monstrous shadow of the Vance family. But there was one more horrifying piece to the puzzle. My brother, Clara whispered, her blood running cold. He's on Van Siecha. He has been for years. The color drained from Julian Croft's face. The cool, controlled billionaire vanished, replaced by a man staring into the face of his own worst failure. No, he breathed, shaking his head in disbelief. Oh God, no. He had been trying to protect the children of the woman he admired, while the very weapon that killed her was being used to poison her son, right under his nose. The irony was so cruel, so complete, it was suffocating. He looked at Clara, his face a canvas of anguish and a newfound terrible resolve. The silent pact he had made with himself to protect her from the truth was shattered. The truth was now the only thing that could save her brother. She left a trail, he said, his voice suddenly sharp, focused. Isabel. She was too smart not to have a contingency plan. In her last letter, she mentioned a fail-safe, a place where she had hidden a complete copy of her data. She called it the Nightingale's Nest. I never knew what it meant. I searched for years, but I was looking as an outsider. Maybe the clue was meant for you. Clara stared at him, her mind racing, scrambling through the fog of her childhood memories. A nest, a nightingale. Her mother used to sing to her every night, a silly, made-up song about a bird who kept all its secrets in a special place. The nightingale sings by the moon's silver light and hides all her treasures away from the night. In a house full of whispers where stories all sleep, her most precious secret, the nightingale keeps. A house full of whispers where stories all sleep. The library, Clara breathed. The public library. The one near our old apartment. We used to go every weekend. She called it our house of whispering stories. A flicker of hope ignited in Julian's eyes. It was a long shot, a child's memory against a 15-year-old secret. But it was all they had. Armed with a fragile shard of a memory, Clara left Croft Tower in a daze. Julian's final words echoed in her mind. Be careful. From this moment on, you are no longer invisible. He had sent her home in his own car, with his personal driver, a silent, grim-faced man who watched the rearview mirror as if expecting an attack at any moment. The city lights, once a source of weary comfort, now seemed to hold a million unseen threats. The next morning, Clara called in sick to the diner, her stomach churning with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. She went to the New York Public Library branch in Queens, a place she hadn't set foot in since she was a little girl. The smell of old paper and wood polish was a punch of nostalgia, so poignant it brought tears to her eyes. The nightingale hides her treasures away. What had her mother hidden, and where? She approached the main reference desk. I know this is a strange question, she began, but is it possible to look up who might have a private study carrel or a long-term locker here from about 15 years ago? The librarian, a kind-faced woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, gave her a sympathetic smile. I'm afraid privacy rules wouldn't allow that, dear, and our records from that long ago are likely archived. Clara's heart sank. It was a dead end. She thanked the woman and turned to leave, her mind a blank wall of despair. As she passed a row of lockers near the back of the building, a small, insignificant detail caught her eye. A single locker, number 19, had a tiny, faded sticker on it. It was a nightingale, a small, hand-drawn bird, the same one her mother used to doodle on the corners of her notebooks. Her breath hitched. She walked closer. The lock was a simple combination lock. What would the combination be? She tried her own birthday, nothing. Leo's birthday, nothing. Her mother's birthday, click. The lock sprang open. Her hands trembling, Clara pulled open the small metal door. Inside was a single, dusty manila envelope. Her name, Clara, was written on the front in her mother's elegant, familiar script. She took the envelope to a quiet corner of the library and opened it. It wasn't filled with complex data or scientific charts. It contained a child's drawing, a crayon picture of their family with her mother, herself, and a small, smiling Leo, holding a bright red balloon. Tucked behind the drawing was a letter. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means the worst has happened, and I am so sorry. I am sorry for leaving you, and for the fear you must be feeling. Know that I never wanted to. Everything I did to protect you and your brother. There are dangerous people who will not want the truth to be known. Do not trust them. But there are good people too. You will find them. My research, the real proof, is safe, but you cannot get to it alone. The key is in the memory of our happiest day, the day we let the red balloon fly. Remember the song it sang, I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Be brave, my sweet girl. Love. Mom tears streamed down Clara's face as she clutched the letter. The happiest day. The red balloon. She remembered it vividly. A sunny afternoon in Central Park. For her 8th birthday. Just a few months before her mother died. They had bought a huge, bright red helium balloon. Leo, only 4, had let go of the string by accident, and they had watched it soar into the sky. Clara had been devastated, but her mother had hugged her and said, "It's not gone. It's just going on an adventure. It's singing its song to the clouds. Singing its song to the clouds." What did that mean? Before she could puzzle it out, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her neighbor, Mrs. Gable, the elderly woman who watched Leo after school. "Clara, you need to come home. There are people here. They say they're from Child Protective Services." Ice flooded Clara's veins. She ran from the library, her mother's cryptic letter clutched in her hand. It was happening. Julian was right. She was no longer invisible. Eleanor Vance was coming for her, and she was starting with the one thing Clara could not bear to lose: her brother. When Clara arrived at her apartment building, her heart pounding with dread, she found 2 social workers, a stern-faced woman and a passive-looking man, standing in the hallway with a terrified Mrs. Gable. Leo was peering out from behind the neighbor's legs, his eyes wide with fear. "Clara Maeve?" the woman asked, her voice cold and official. "We've received an anonymous report concerning the welfare of your brother, Leo Maeve. Allegations of neglect. Unsafe living conditions." "Neglect?" Clara gasped, looking from their accusatory faces to her pristine, if humble apartment door. "That's insane. I work 2 jobs to care for him. He has everything he needs." "We'll be the judge of that," the woman said, pushing past her into the apartment. "We'll need to take Leo into temporary custody while we conduct a full investigation." This was Eleanor's handiwork. It was a classic power play designed to cripple her, to terrorize her into silence. A boiling, white-hot rage erupted inside Clara, eclipsing her fear. This was the first shot in a war she didn't ask for, but one she would be damned if she lost. "You are not taking him anywhere," Clara said, her voice low and shaking with fury. She stepped between the social workers and her brother. "You have no grounds. You have no court order. You are harassing a sick child, and if you do not leave right now, I will call the police and my lawyer." She didn't have a lawyer, but she delivered the line with such ferocious conviction that the woman hesitated. It was a standoff, a battle of wills in the cramped hallway of her apartment building. The air crackled with tension. This was Eleanor's first direct attack, a brutal, calculated move to break her spirit. Clara could feel the walls closing in, the terrifying power of the Vance Empire pressing down on her. She thought about her mother, cornered and threatened, and found a new well of strength. Just as the social worker was about to press the issue, Clara's phone rang. It was an unknown number. She answered, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. "This is Clara Maeve." "Put me on speaker," a familiar, low voice commanded. It was Julian Croft. Clara did as she was told. "This is Julian Croft," his voice boomed from the small phone speaker, radiating authority and immense power. "I am Miss Maeve's legal counsel. I have already been in contact with the Director of Child Protective Services, who has no knowledge of your visit. I have also traced the anonymous tip back to a burner phone purchase this morning. Unless you and your associate wish to be named in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for harassment and intimidation, I suggest you leave the premises immediately. You have 60 seconds. The change in the social workers was instantaneous. The color drained from their faces. They exchanged a panicked look, mumbled an apology, and practically fled down the hallway. Clara hung up, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She scooped a crying Leo into her arms, burying her face in his hair, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel. She had won the battle, but she knew, with chilling certainty, that the war had just begun. Eleanor Vance had shown her hand. She would not stop at threats. She would use every weapon in her arsenal to destroy Clara and bury her mother's secret forever. Later that evening, Julian's driver picked her and Leo up. He took them not to a sterile hotel, but to a warm, comfortable townhouse in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. Julian was waiting for them inside. The house was clearly a private residence, filled with books and art, but it had the feeling of a place that hadn't been truly lived in for a long time. "You're not safe in your apartment anymore," he said, his face grim. "Eleanor won't be so clumsy next time. She'll come at you harder." He looked at Leo, who was staring at him with wide, curious eyes. A look of profound pain crossed Julian's face. "He looks like her," he said softly. He then turned to Clara, his focus absolute. "The letter. What did it say?" Clara, still shaken, explained the cryptic clue. "The day we let the red balloon fly. Remember the song it sang?" "I don't understand. It was just a balloon." Julian's eyes narrowed in thought. "A song? Did it make a sound?" "No," Clara said, frustrated. "My mom just said it was singing its song to the clouds." They were silent for a long moment, the puzzle hanging between them. Julian walked over to a state-of-the-art computer system in the corner of the living room. Isabel was a scientist, he mused, his fingers flying across the keyboard. She thought in terms of data, signals, frequencies. A song to the clouds, a signal to a satellite? He shook his head. Too complicated for the time. He paused. "What was the balloon made of?" "I don't know. It was just a normal red balloon." "No," Julian insisted, his mind clearly working at a furious pace. "Think, Clara. Was there anything special about it? Anything at all?" Clara closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that sunny day in the park. The feel of the string in her hand, the way the sun shone through the red skin of the balloon, her mother's smile, and then she remembered. There was a small logo on the balloon, a tiny silver decal. "A weather balloon," she whispered, her eyes flying open. "It wasn't from a toy store. My mom brought it from her lab. She said it was a special kind of weather balloon." Julian froze, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He turned to look at her, a slow, dawning realization on his face. "A weather balloon doesn't just carry sensors," he said, his voice electric with discovery. "It carries a transmitter. It sends a signal, a song." She attached her data to a transmitter and sent it up, disguised as a lost balloon. He began typing furiously, pulling up archived atmospheric data, flight path trajectories from that specific day 15 years ago. The signal would have been recorded by any number of government or private receivers. The trick is finding it. What was the frequency? The encryption key? Remember the song it sang. "It wasn't a real song," Clara said, the pieces suddenly clicking into place in her own mind. "It was the song she always sang to me, the Nightingale Lullaby. The notes are the key." She hummed the simple, haunting melody that was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. Julian recorded it, his systems converting the melody into a sequence of musical notes, then into a numerical cipher. He fed the cipher into his search algorithm. For a tense minute, the screen was a blur of scrolling data, then a single line of code buried in the archives of a defunct meteorological satellite lit up. The file name was Nightingale. Julian Croft, the man who controlled half of New York's skyline, looked at Clara with an expression of pure awe. "She did it," he breathed. "The brilliant, beautiful woman. She sent her proof to the stars." He clicked the file. It began to download, a 15-year-old message from a murdered mother, a testament of truth finally coming home. As the progress bar slowly filled, Clara knew this was the weapon they needed. This was the truth that would either set them free or get them killed. Eleanor Vance had tried to silence her sister-in-law, but she had failed to account for one thing: a mother's love, a love powerful enough to reach across time and space, a love that had just delivered the key to her downfall. The final confrontation was no longer a question of if, but when. The downloaded file was not merely data, it was a digital ghost, a treasure trove of righteous fury meticulously preserved. As Julian and Clara opened the first folder, it felt like opening a time capsule sealed with grief. It was everything Julian had suspected, and so much more. The core of the package was Isabel's complete, unredacted research, terabytes of raw data, simulations, molecular diagrams, and clinical projections that painted a horrifyingly clear picture of Vancia's degenerative effects. But it was the personal files that held the true, devastating power. There were dozens of dated video logs, a private diary of a scientist racing against time. In the early entries, Isabel was vibrant, her voice filled with the thrill of discovery as she detailed her work. She would pace her small lab, gesturing wildly at a whiteboard, her brilliant mind moving faster than her words. Clara watched, mesmerized and heartbroken, as her mother laughed, frowned in concentration, and celebrated small breakthroughs. It was like being given a gift she never thought she'd receive, new memories of the mother she barely remembered. Then the tone shifted. The logs became more subdued, recorded late at night, with dark circles under Isabel's eyes. Her voice, once buoyant, was now calm, measured, and resolute. She documented her meetings with Eleanor Vance, her initial hope turning to disbelief, then to a cold, clinical horror as she realized her findings were not being challenged but deliberately buried. Eleanor doesn't dispute the data, Isabel said in one log, her voice a tight whisper. She just doesn't care. She spoke about shareholder value, about the family legacy. She looked at my charts showing irreversible nerve damage, and all she saw was a threat to the bottom line. It was like showing a predator a picture of its prey and expecting empathy. The final videos were almost unbearable for Clara to watch. Her mother's fear was a palpable thing, a shadow in the room with her. She detailed the subtle threats, the files that went missing from her computer, the feeling of being watched. The very last video, time-stamped the day before she was killed, was her final testament. She wasn't looking at a camera. She was looking directly at her daughter, across a chasm of 15 years. If anything happens to me, Isabel said, her blue-green eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to transcend the screen, know that Eleanor Vance is responsible. This was never just about business. It is a profound moral failure. She is choosing profits over people, silence over science. Let this be my testimony. Clara, Leo, be brave. Always, always choose the truth. The video ended. The silence in the room was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was a ghost accusation, irrefutable, damning, and aimed like a spear through the heart of the Vance empire. Julian, who had stood motionless throughout the final video, finally spoke, his voice a low, tight chord of cold rage. This changes everything. This isn't about a corporate recall and a financial settlement anymore. This is premeditated murder. The air in the room crackled with a new, dangerous energy. Their mission had evolved. This was no longer just about exposing a corporate crime. It was about avenging a life. Their plan had to be as meticulous, as brilliant, as the one Isabel had created to preserve her work. A simple leak to the press was amateur hour. Eleanor, a master of media manipulation, would use her phalanx of lawyers and PR virtuosos to instantly muddy the waters. They would claim it was a sophisticated fabrication by a corporate rival, a digital deepfake, anything to create an inkling of doubt. In the modern world, doubt was all a lie needed to survive. They needed to detonate this bomb in a way that left no room for spin, no quarter for denial. Julian turned to a large screen on the wall, his face illuminated by the glow. He brought up a digital calendar. Vance Pharmaceuticals is holding its annual Miracle of Medicine Gala in 3 days, he said, his finger tapping a highlighted date. It's their crown jewel event. The mayor will be there. Senators, the titans of finance and media. It's the one night Eleanor allows herself to be a queen. She'll give the keynote address, celebrating Vancetia as the cornerstone of her family's legacy and philanthropic spirit. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. You want to confront her there? A grim, predatory smile, the first Clara had ever seen, touched Julian's lips. It did not reach his eyes. Not just confront her, Clara. We're going to put her on trial in front of her own world. We will make her legacy a eulogy for her own damnation. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of controlled, clandestine activity. The townhouse transformed into a high-tech war room. Julian was a general marshaling his forces, leveraging 2 decades of immense resources and carefully cultivated alliances. He made calls to people who owed him their careers, their fortunes, their secrets, his voice shifting from charming persuasion to ice-cold command. A discreet team of the world's best digital forensics experts was flown in, working around the clock to create an unassailable authentication package for Isabel's data. A cybersecurity team, poached from a government intelligence agency, began mapping the gala's network architecture, preparing for a hostile surgical takeover of their audiovisual systems. And Clara, the quiet waitress from the Starlight Diner, prepared for the performance of her life. She did not sleep. Fueled by coffee and a burning sense of purpose, she immersed herself in her mother's notes, memorizing key data points, understanding the complex science not just as a grieving daughter, but as her mother's final, most dedicated student. She watched Isabel's videos over and over, not just listening to the words, but absorbing her mother's cadence, her courage, her unwavering conviction. She was no longer just fighting for Leo. She was becoming her mother's voice, her living, breathing testimony. The night of the gala arrived, a tempest cloaked in velvet and diamonds. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a glittering ecosystem of power, a sea of couture gowns and bespoke tuxedos. The air hummed with polite laughter and the clinking of crystal, a symphony of influence. Clara, transformed by a simple but elegant black dress that Julian's assistant had procured, and with her hair styled in soft waves that echoed her mother's, felt like a ghost walking through a dream. Every nerve in her body was a live wire. Julian, a specter of vengeance at her side in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looked every bit the billionaire titan, but his eyes were scanning the room with the cold, patient focus of a hunter. They moved through the crowd, two anonymous figures in a room of luminaries, their anonymity their greatest weapon. Finally, the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the room. Eleanor Vance, in a shimmering silver gown that caught the light like a net of captured stars, walked onto the stage to a wave of thunderous applause. She was radiant, a queen surveying her court, her smile a masterpiece of practiced warmth. "Tonight," Eleanor began, her voice resonating with polished confidence, "we celebrate a legacy of healing, of hope, a legacy begun by my father and carried on in the cherished memory of my dear sister, whose boundless passion for science inspired our company's greatest achievement. Vancetia." The mention of her sister, a calculated piece of cynical theater, was their cue. "Now," Julian whispered into a lapel microphone, his hand a steady grounding presence on Clara's elbow. As Eleanor paused for effect, the two massive screens flanking the stage, which were displaying the gleaming Vance Pharmaceuticals logo, suddenly flickered to black. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Before Eleanor could react, the screens lit up again, not with a logo, but with a live, high-definition feed of Clara's face, projected 10 feet high. A waiter, part of Julian's team, discreetly passed her a microphone. "My name is Clara Maeve," she said, her voice amplified throughout the silent, cavernous space. It was not the shaky whisper of a frightened girl, but the clear, steady tone of a woman claiming her power. "And my mother was Isabel Maeve, the scientist who truly created Vancetia." On the stage, Eleanor froze, her perfect smile collapsing as if her strings had been cut. Confusion, then shock, then a dawning horror washed over her face. The audience was a sea of upturned, bewildered faces. "You stand here tonight and you celebrate a legacy," Clara continued, her eyes locked on Eleanor's. "A daughter's judgment delivered across the stunned room. But you left out the most important part of my mother's story. You left out the part where she discovered Vancetia was a slow-acting poison, and you left out the part where you killed her to hide the truth." "Pandemonium!" Gasps echoed off the gilded ceiling. The room erupted in a roar of shocked whispers. Eleanor's face, projected in merciless detail on the screens beside Clara's, had turned a ghastly shade of white. "This is absurd," she sputtered into her microphone, her voice losing its polished veneer. "Security! Remove this woman! She's clearly unstable, a disturbed individual." "Am I?" Clara asked, her voice dropping to a calm, lethal register. "Or was my mother the unstable one when she recorded this final message for you, Eleanor?" The screen behind Eleanor flickered again, this time displaying Isabel's final video log. Her mother's face, so full of life and fire, filled the room, a beautiful specter of truth. Her voice, clear and damning, echoed from the speakers. "If anything happens to me, Know that Eleanor Vance is responsible. The audience was in an uproar. The illusion of the evening had been shattered. On stage, Eleanor was trapped in the spotlight, her meticulously crafted world crumbling around her in a public execution. "This is a lie, a fabrication. Doctored footage," she shrieked, her voice now shrill with pure desperation. "The data doesn't lie," Julian's voice boomed from the side of the room. He had taken another microphone, stepping out of the shadows. His presence commanded immediate silence. "And the complete, forensically authenticated data from Isabel Maeve's research, along with this video, has just been delivered to the servers of every major news outlet, the FDA, and the Department of Justice. It's over, Eleanor." The final boiling point had been reached. The pressure that had been building for 15 years had finally, spectacularly, exploded. Her face contorted with a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Eleanor stared at Clara. In the face of the quiet waitress, she had dismissed as insignificant collateral damage. She saw the ghost of the brilliant woman she had silenced, risen again to claim her justice. As hotel security, followed closely by the first uniformed NYPD officers, began to move toward the stage, pushing through the chaotic, horrified crowd, Clara felt not a surge of triumph, but a profound, aching sadness. This was not a victory. It was a reckoning, and the echoes of its arrival would be heard around the world,